Welcome to this edition of the weekly dialogues under the Jaipur Dialogues, and we have Abhijit Iyer Mitra with us. We had a session with him earlier on the question of enrichment of culture and enrichment of the riches, the wealth. Now there is also another issue that has cropped up, and that says that Mughals, and I guess the Mughals also includes Aurangzeb, if not Jahangir and Shah Jahan, that Mughals were very secular in their outlook, and they were very even-handed with their public, and they were very welfare-oriented, and they were, it's like the great welfare state of India between 1947 and 1991. There was something like that. Don't take it otherwise. But my study of the Mughals and the study of the various influences that were there on the Mughals is very different. Why it is touted as very secular is very often that people say, they come out with this argument that they were under the influence of the Sufis. But then that question crops up, were the Sufis secular in the first place? Because there is this great divide between what is called the Tariqat and the Shariat. Tariqa is a Sufi sect, and Tariqa is further subdivided into what is called Silsilas. And for the larger part of this Mughal empire, they were under the influence of one of the more bigoted Sufi Tariqa and Silsila of the Naqshbandis. And these Naqshbandis were led by the prima donna. Among them was Sheikh Ahmad Sarhindi, followed by his son, Sheikh Muhammad Masoom, then goes on to Sheikh Saifuddin. And after that, the whole line gets mixed up, and their line gets diffused into what is called the authors of the Fatawa Alamgiri of Aurangzeb. And I think those people who have any idea of history would know what kind of a collection of Fatawa Alamgiri was. It was one of the most bigoted construction and prescription of hate against the Kafir. And the prime author, or one of the main authors of Fatawa Alamgiri was Shah Abdul Rahim, who was the father of the great Shah Waliullah. You know Shah Waliullah, who scripted the Battle of Panipat, and who invited Ahmad Shah Abdali and created an alliance with Najibullah and even the Shia Asifullah. And his idea of India having turned into Darul Harb ultimately led to that battle. Then Shah Waliullah, then you have Shah Abdul Aziz, and Shah Abdul Aziz has some very good disciples. Out of that, one line diverges into Devband, and the another line in which Javed Akhtar's great-great-grandfather, this gentleman called Maulana Fazle Haq Khairabadi, is very important, because the divergence starts the point where Shah Fazle Haq Khairabadi, he's called Allama Fazle Haq Khairabadi issues a fatwa against this famous book of Shah Ismail, who was in turn a disciple of both Shah Abdul Aziz and Sayyid Ahmad Barelvi of the Balakot fame. You remember Sayyid Ahmad Barelvi?
Mm.
And it is from this that Shah Ismail's Taqwatul Iman, then the fatwa against it by Fazle Haq Khairabadi, and from there the line diverges. Let's not go into further details. I'll reserve that for another article at another time. But this whole issue of secularism of the Mughals is mixed up with the Sufi influence of them, and what kind of Sufi influence was exercised on them, I just detailed out. So do you have your own take on this, Abhijit?
Yes, I actually have two takes on it. Now you'll have to forgive me. I don't remember names as well as you do because, unfortunately, Islamic naming convention doesn't allow for much naming diversity. Unfortunately, even India is going that way. Once upon a time, we used to have a great myriad of names. Today, every kid is called Rahul or Varun or Deepak or something like that, even it's happening across the world, in Europe, you could tell the name. Gottfredo would be Italian. Gottfried would be German. In England, you'll be called Ethelbert or Ethelstan or something like that. Today, everybody is John or David or Roger or something like that. So let's give credit where it's due. Islam invented this lack of naming diversity, in that it was centuries ahead of everybody else. So let's look at practical examples of Sufi tolerance. Number one is Sheikh Hamdani, the guy who went to Kashmir, slaughtered people left, right, and center. If you want to understand Sufi tolerance, and mind you,
he was
Kashmiri
also
culture.
He was also a Farooqi, by the way. He was a Farooqi Ashraf.
Yeah, and I've been to his grave too, by the way, incidentally. Anyway, so, and if you want to understand the Sufis are peaceful, ask yourself, how is it these Sufis managed to kick out 600,000 Kashmiri Pandits, oh so tolerant, oh so secular Sufis managed to kick out 600,000 Pandits under Sufi influence. This was before the information revolution had happened, before all this homogenization and a lot of this Islamofascism is blamed on homogenization of Islam. Well, this happened before that, right? How did it happen? And the much greater example, the arch Sufi, the absolute golden boy of Sufism, was Tamerlane. Okay, the same Tamerlane who comes to Delhi. I've been to his, I forget his guru's, I don't know what the Muslim term is, because, he's buried at the feet of his guru kind of thing in Samarkand. That guru used to go and bless his armies before every battle. And this is the same Tamerlane that depopulated Central Asia, Turkey, Iran, and India to the tune of about 11 to 12 million people in a day and age where that entire region's population was about 70 to 80 million people. Okay, this is the kind of Sufism that you're talking about in purely practical terms. This is the man who comes to Delhi, kills off 100,000 people. Now, Sufism has never ever been peaceful. Just because they sing qawwalis and in Turkey they do these whirling dervish dances doesn't make them very peaceful people. I can also take you, I've actually seen cannibals in Papua New Guinea. It was one of the scariest experiences of my life because we could actually see, we met a person with kuru, which is, a laughing sickness, which you only get from consuming human brains. And they were dancing beautifully. They were singing beautifully. That didn't mean they were any less cannibals or any less absolutely Stone Age violent, prone to violence. Their senses are binary. See, they've only got about 500-600 words in their language. So there is no nuance there. It goes from I want to kill you to I want to hug you in the space of 10 minutes. Extraordinary levels of societal violence. So just because people dance and sing doesn't make them peaceful people, number one. Number two, I mean, let's just forget the Sufi influence, because I think this Sufism is sort of overblown, because Indians, despite being the worst suffering at the hands of Islamic terrorism, are also the most clueless about Islam per se and the different schools within Islam. This is a sort of canard that has been spread about peaceful Sufi, including repeated by the Prime Minister, might I add. He actually put that out what was it, in 2018 or 2019 sometime, about, adopt Sufism that is peaceful. I mean, forget the fact that it broke every law of secularism, that you can't prioritize one sect over another, but that's a different issue. But let's look at secularism itself. There are so many different strands of secularism. Secularism, it starts with French secularism, laïcité, in correct terms, because remember, the Romans and the Egyptians were also very secular. They allowed all their conquered subjects, In fact, they used to go worship at the conquered subjects' temples. The Romans, for example, and the Greeks, when Alexander liberates Egypt from Persia, he is recognized as the son of Ra. He is recognized as the pharaoh, and he does obeisance at the temple of Ra out there. He recognizes Ra to be Zeus. Similarly, the Romans recognized Zeus and Ra to be Jupiter. And there was a lot of this kind of syncretism, which is what you see in India as well. You know, all these gods and goddesses that we have, they were all individually old gods and goddesses that were worshipped by the people, which got absorbed into the pantheon. None of it was demolished. None of it was smashed. It all got absorbed into the pantheon. So we were always secular in that sense. The pagan religions are fundamentally secular because they are syncretic. The problem with monotheism is it is a jealous God. If you worship any other god, the god gets jealous. With polytheism, you have to appease all the gods. So if you come across new gods, your instinct isn't to destroy them. It's like, oh my God, this is a new god I didn't know about. Are they going to strike me dead? Let me go worship them as well. So you go worship them, right? So when Alexander comes to India, he is noted as going to several temples and praying, and he is acknowledged as the son of Krishna, Hercules. They used to think Hercules was Krishna, kind of whatever. Now, modern secularism, the way we know it, I'm not talking about organic secularism, comes from the French Revolution and laïcité, unfortunately from Robespierre and, you know, those very murderous revolutionaries of the French Revolution that started the Reign of Terror. And for them, this laïcité was what? It was the complete removal of church from state, to the extent that they were forcing people, it was completely anti-clerical. The kind of restrictions they placed on the Catholic Church, on priests and things like that, were quite severe. Contrast this with American secularism, which is today the stock standard of secularism. What did that derive from? These pilgrim fathers in the Mayfair, that ship called the Mayfair that landed, I think, was it in Massachusetts or Connecticut? I forget now where it landed. They were Puritans from England. Now, what people don't realize is the English Protestant persecutions of the Catholics were far, far worse than the Spanish Inquisition ever was. Okay, and these were Puritans derived from that Protestant tradition, who even by British Protestant standards were considered too extreme, and they got kicked out of England and they went off to America. And their thing was, we are lunatics, but we should see to it that every lunatic should have the freedom of expression. Unless, of course, you're Red Indians and things like that, in which case they'll shoot you and kill you. But it was freedom of expression of all Christian and to some extent Jews. Jews were persecuted initially. Let's not forget that. The emancipation of Jews in the new colonies happens very, very later. So of all Christians in the New World, and it is these complete religious lunatics out there. So in America, secularism means giving birth to all kinds of loonies. In France, it is the complete suppression of religion from any state expression. India is dharma nirpeksh, which is kind of like the American version, that the state will not choose sides. Now tell me, under which definition of secularism do the Mughals fit in? Okay, because the only thing the Mughals did, and that too, it was from Aurangzeb through Jahangir and Shah Jahan, was they abolished jizya. Bas. Okay. Did they separate church from state? No. In fact, Aurangzeb made the state religion Deen-e-Ilahi when he converted out of it. Very admirable that he committed apostasy, had the brains to do that even then. But he intertwined the state with religion. Okay. The best that can be said about him was that he was kind of dharma nirpeksh, not even dharma nirpeksh in the purest sense of the word. Okay. Sorry, let me just quickly finish that. What standard of dharma nirpeksh, laïcité, or American secularism did the Mughal emperors meet?
In fact, every Mughal emperor was called the Amirul Islam. His army was called Lashkar-e-Islam, and the chief theologian theologian of the Mughal state was always called Shaykh al-Islam. So that is the Mughal secularism for you. And what they did was, of course, they kind of, in Hanafi Islam, you sometimes allow the infidel to live. So in the Hanafi sect, because they were followers of Hanafi sect, in fact, some of them have said that Indians are lucky that we have the Hanafi Islam here. Otherwise, if it had been the Shafi'i, then the only choice would have been Islam or death. But because of Hanafi Islam, we are allowing you to live. So because the Mughals allowed Indians to live on pain of jizya, it seems that they were secular. This is the Mughal kind of a secularism. You can have one more addition to that list of different kind of secularism that you have.
In which case, let's bring back that kind of secularism. But now being a Hindu majority state, are you willing to accept a reverse jizya as secularism too?
That's not allowed under Shariat.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's counter Shariat in that sense, because if that is secularism, if the majority imposing a tax for you to practice your religion is secularism, the principle applies to every religion as being secularism, that the majority religion can impose a tax on any minority religion for the practice of their religion. And that is, by the definition of these historians, secularism. Simple question. Are Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states, Qatar, UAE, they do not impose jizya. Fact. Are they secular states?
Of course not. But then...
their entire argument for Mughal secularism is Akbar abolished jizya. Bas.
Yeah, but then it was...
you know, the kind of mental gymnastics, the kind of cranial rectal inversions you have to do to come up with this kind of positions is just incredible. And you know, they actually justify jizya saying, look, there was zakat on Muslims. 1/10 of their income had to be given up as zakat for charity. And therefore, it was just an equivalent tax on Hindus. भाई अच्छी बात है भाई कि एक religion को करना है तो दूसरे को भी यही करना पड़ेगा क्या?
No.
How is this secularism? So we can also say that because every Hindu worships on Diwali, therefore Indian secularism is to see to it that every Muslim should also buy diyas, crackers, and light them up on Diwali day.
No, but the incidence of zakat is much less than the incidence of jizya. Jizya can go up to 1/50th of your income, whereas zakat is very light. And zakat is also voluntary because it is one of the 5 foundational principles of Islam, so people follow it voluntarily. It is not exacted in those terms. That is one. And
but you understand the kind of mental gymnastics these people resort to justify these things, the false equivalences. And it actually finds takers because clowns like these are considered your historians today. Rana Safi, Irfan Habib. Irfan Habib, of course, has a history of promoting these kind of quack scholars.
Oh, of course. They come from that old Aligarh school. I told you, Muhammad Habib started it. Muhammad Habib, Irfan Habib's father. His able disciples, I don't know whether you know this line. His able disciples were Satish Chandra and Nurul Hasan. I'm sure.
Oh God, the man who
rings a bell.
Communistized education in India.
Yes, then what happened was that Muhammad Habib got friendly with Motilal Nehru and established another line of his Aligarh school in Allahabad. And then he joined, after the collapse of the Khilafat movement, what happened was that Motilal Nehru and some of his other Congress colleagues, they founded another party called Khilafat Swaraj Party, which continued in the same vein. Muhammad Habib joined the Khilafat Swaraj Party, became a member of the Legislative Council. Later on, when the Khilafat Swaraj Party re-merged, it's around, I think, 1925, 26. Of course, Motilal Nehru was immediately president again in 1928. And in 1929, you had another president, you know.
Yeah.
So Motilal, he was very close to Motilal Nehru. Through Motilal Nehru, he became close to his son and to his granddaughter. In fact, what used to happen was that there are various rumors, but let's say, to be very moderate and to be very fair, he was the inspiration behind discovery of India being written. Please connect the dots. And he used to personally tutor Indira Priyadarshini. Then you go on to the 60s and 70s and you look at Nurul Hasan and you look at the takeover. You look at the takeover of the history academia. So all this, this comes from there. Coming to the Mughal secularism, I would request you also, because you're studying this aspect, and I would also request my viewers to look at 3 documents which are either from the times of Mughals or inspired by the Mughals. And they are followed almost universally by every Muslim cleric. I don't think there would be one Muslim cleric who would not be following one of these 3. Number 1 is Fatawa-e-Alamgiri, which got compiled by Aurangzeb, and Aurangzeb is regarded as a wali, friend of God, friend of Allah, by a principal sect, the Barelvi, which is about 80% of Indian Muslims. Then the Devband and Bareli together, they account for nearly 100%, except for some minuscule Ahle Hadith type people who won't be more than 1% or so. Devband has what is called Hidayah. They're very Arabic. Anything that the Devband talks, they will only talk in terms of Arabic pronunciations. So whenever you see Arabic pronunciation, 90% it would be a Devband guy. So they have got what is called Hidayah. What does Hidayah say about jihad? Jihad दीन हक की ओर बुलाने और उससे इनकार करने वाले से जंग करने को कहते हैं. Secularism. And then there is Fatawa-e-Razaviya by Ahmad Raza Barelvi, all 30 volumes of it. It has a section called Nafrat ke Ahkam, commandments of hatred, whom to hate, how to hate. So this is the secularism which is directly derived from the Mughals. And of course, I did detail out some principal actors. So if this is the kind of secularism that Mughals used to practice and that has been inherited by the rest of the secular crowd among the followers of different Sufi sects or non-Sufi sects or whatever, then I think that does say a lot about the secularism of the people who are calling it secularism.
But sir, let's also make this international. Why just stop at Mughals? Tell me one Muslim majority country that is secular. People used to say Malaysia and Turkey. In Turkey, I can honestly tell you they are not secular. They never were, even under Kemal Atatürk. It is not a modern day thing that they have become unsecular. The root of so-called Turkish secularism was this one paragraph in the constitution which defines what it is to be a Turk. And the definition is, if you feel Turkish, you're a Turk. Okay, that is the basis of saying that Kemal Atatürk was secular. Now, wearing Western clothes, introducing Western dancing, and taking off the veil doesn't make you secular. Because even with Kemal Atatürk, what he did was he crushed the Sufis, violently crushed the Sufis. There were Naqshbandi Sufis out there that were violently crushed, and he made Hanafism to be the sole and only denomination of state Islam out there. So, Turkey isn't as secular as it's made out to be. And this starts right from Kemal Atatürk thing, not post Kemal Atatürk. Remember, the entire the nuance of Turkishness, even in their anthem, is the flag itself that Kemal Atatürk chose was the hilal.
Oh, yes.
Right. So the Turkey was never as it is less secular now than it was under Kemal Atatürk. That didn't make Kemal Atatürk any more secular at his stage and juncture. Remember, Kemal Atatürk also banned the speaking of the Kurdish language. Right. And that was done very deliberately to crush any subnational identities within the Ottoman Empire. Because in the Ottoman Empire, you called yourself a Muslim. You didn't call yourself a Turk. Calling yourself a Turk meant you were kind of a country bumpkin. So you never said Turk. That's very much a modern thing. Malaysia, you have the entire Bumiputra policy, where to this day, in spite of having reservations for the last 60 years, you still require reservation for your Muslim majority to compete against a Tamil Hindu Christian and a Chinese Christian Buddhist minority. Where is that secular? So
they also,
this is becoming...
They have the Sharia law for...
they have the Sharia law in several of their states, not across the board, but in several of their states, they have Sharia law for everybody. Now, this is highly problematic because, fine, you say that, you know, the Mughal Empire was secular. Show me examples of Islamic secularism today.
Oh, of course.
It's that simple.
There are none, because even if Sharia law is not the official law, but the resonance of the Sharia law is always there, and Sharia law is an exclusivist law, because in Sharia law, the non-believer is zimmi by definition. And zimmi only has the rights which are given to him through the zimma, the pact that believer has with him under Sharia.
And what is worse is, because right now, because of the prevalence of Wahhabism, Salafism, you know, there is this entire notion of the takfir, derived from the same word as kafir, but different.
To make
a takfir is an inferior Muslim. And why does this come about? It comes about because of Ibn Taymiyyah from Haran in what is Turkey and then Damascus. Now, the bugger himself, Ibn Taymiyyah himself, wasn't an Arab. He was an Albanian or a red-haired Turk. He definitely had red hair, this much we know, but he was a Turk or Albanian. We're not exactly sure what he was. Now, except that he wasn't an Arab. He comes up with this notion of takfir because he says only the Arab denomination Islam is the true Islam. And if you're not an Arab, you can basically never interpret the Quran properly. You can never really be a true Muslim. Right? And this is because out of the 1,400 years of Islamic history, only about 200 to 250 were written by Arabs, if that. Maximum decisive period, only about 100 to 150. Even by the time of the Umayyad Caliph, the Turkification of Islam had already begun big time.
Oh, yes.
During the Abbasid period, it was full-on Turkification.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
And remember, the Turks started ruling North Africa and Egypt. At one point, Egypt was called Turkey. In those days, Turkey wasn't called Turkey. Egypt used to be called Turkiye. Right? So you have this entire pattern of takfiriyat, which is now gaining ground, which is why you see all these things. There was that idiot MP who went to parliament wearing an Arab headdress, a tribal Arab headdress. Do you remember that? He was photographed entering parliament in a tribal Arab headdress. Now, I'm just amazed that, you know, Mongoloid Malaysians and dark as hell Indians trying to pretend to be Arabs of all things. This is a bigger joke than me painting myself white just to get into a white-only club. It's like those gollywog jokes you used to have, you know, because there were only white people allowed to act at one point of time. They had to paint their faces black to pretend to be black people.
That's called the Al-Pakistan syndrome.
Oh.
It's I think present more in Pakistan. So they are all al-Pakistanis. They are no longer.
Oh, yeah. Because there's no P, no? But you see that also in a proud civilization like Iran. So original Farsi does not have F. It's Parsi. It's P. It's not F.
Yeah.
The F word comes in purely because of the Arab influence. So things, for example, the Straits of Hormuz. Hormuz is the modern Persian word for Ahura Mazda. It started off being Ahura Mazda, then it became Hormuzd in Middle Persian during the Sassanid period, and then in the Muslim period it became Hormuz. But even that, they try to suppress in Iran today. So even a proud culture that kind of conquered their conquerors. In that sense, what we call Arab culture is Byzantine and Persian culture, where the two old civilizations civilized the invading barbarians. And what does it tell you? That the first epigraphic mention of Muhammad is in 692 AD in the Al-Aqsa, in the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem. And what is amazing is even in 633, when we have Byzantine and Sassanid records of the Arabs, they do not see it as a Muslim invasion. They had a notion of prophethood, because remember, prophets are very important in the Christian canon. But there is no mention of Muhammad being a prophet. They call him the king of the Arabs.
As far as this particular thing of the Arabization of Persia, I think you know that an Ayatollah who wears that black turban has to be an Arab. You cannot have a local Persian as an Ayatollah. So that is one of their the principles of their creed. And as far as this whole history of the Arabs is concerned, we know that there are too many loopholes, but of course that is a forbidden territory where we don't go. But otherwise...
just one other thing to add. This whole saga of, what's her name?
Yeah, sorry, we just lost the connection for a bit. So we were discussing about the marriage of Hazrat Ali.
Migrated to Canada long back, not during the Civil War. But the amount of hostility he faced was just incredible. I am a Hindu kafir and I face less hostility than the Syrian Arab in Iran, which I found was truly amazing. I mean, so much for, this whole Islamic Brotherhood thing. And in spite of that, even in that society, in order to be a religious leader, you have to claim Arabic ancestry.
Yes, if you remember V.S. Naipaul, he said that the Arabic imperialism, it imposes extreme demands on the converts. And that is why that changes the complete psychology of the converts. So we bring this discussion to a close with the summary that no Islamic ruler in an Islamic state can ever claim to be secular. That is written in the edicts, it is written in the scriptures, and the kind of exclusivist religious edicts that they have. Anybody to claim that Mughals can be secular is talking up some kind of a fool's. Well, let's say he's just being foolish, that's all. Thank you, Abhijit. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for having me, sir.
Press the bell icon on YouTube and don't miss another update.